So, after a very long hiatus, I'm finally back for yet another Nerd Theater. It's been a little while, but I wanted to make this episode dedicated to a new A24 horror movie coming out very, very soon called Hereditary. Now, I, like many others, are very excited for this movie, not only because the trailer looked great, it has a lot of good marketing, but also for the fact that it's been getting a lot of good reception and a lot of buzz from both critics and audiences alike. People who saw it early at early test screenings or whatnot. It's kind of a movie that kind of interests me because I've kind of been intrigued by the horror movie genre as a whole, especially as of recent, not only because I'm a fan of the genre, but also because horror movies in general have been in a weird state recently, especially more so in the 21st century, more now than ever. But ever since the early to mid 2000s, there is kind of a weird up and down roller coaster of horror films. You got a lot of found footage movies after that became popular. A lot of overexposure of those, kind of an overuse of jump scares and cheap tactics like that. So it kind of, for a long time, it was a huge swarm just of bad horror movies. And every now and again, a good one would slip in there, but very infrequently. But it seems to be more so now than ever that there's kind of an upturn where the good to bad ratio of horror movies is kind of evening out. I mean, there's still some bad ones, probably a lot more than there are good. But that being said, it seems like there's new, fresh, and fun ideas being cranked out very frequently now, more so than ever. I think with films like Get Out, it kind of helped, and all the Oscar buzz and award nominations that received, it kind of helped bring more awareness to the horror genre and kind of have people take it more seriously. So now there's kind of more of a push to make them more of quality rather of quantity, which I'm all for. So another film I think is responsible for that push is 2016's The Witch, which is a very effective film, but it's also a very divisive film because while I think it's effective and very frightening and memorable, there were reports of audience members who left the theater because they were upset by it. There's people who laughed at the movie, apparently, which is very bizarre. But I think a lot of that can be attributed to, because of all these tropes and cliches that audiences have become used to, it's kind of something that kind of flips that all on its head is kind of caused or met with confusion. I kind of wanted to touch on what I thought the movie did well. Just getting right off the bat here, this movie is directed by Robert Eggers, who is a kind of a small-time director, kind of an unknown. I didn't know about him before this movie, surely, but I don't think he's really made any features aside from this one. I know he has a new movie coming out, but besides that, very few works have kind of reached the public eye by this guy. So The Witch, if you've seen any of the marketing, trailers, whatnot, you're probably well aware that this movie takes place in the early 1600s. I believe it was the 1630s, but I don't know if they ever really specify. But it takes place in 1600s New England, just a few decades before the infamous Salem witch trials took place. But that being said, the Great Witch Scare is still very prominent in this film, and it's the driving force of much of the suspense throughout the movie. What really kicks this off is a New England family. They're a Puritan family, and they're kicked from their Christian humble abode, this small town that they call home, and they're for various sins that aren't really specified, which I kind of like. They left ambiguous. This movie actually starts right at the opening of a court hearing, and so the family is exiled. They're banished from their home, and they are forced to go live out on their own. and they build up a home and they kind of base themselves out in the middle of nowhere. And that's when things start to pick up. Immediately watching this movie, it's clear that it's a slow burn, but it is not an aimless meander. It's very clear there's always something being built up to. There's little itty bitty pieces that kind of act as stepping stones for something greater at the end. Now, something that really caught my eye was the acting of this movie, especially people like the actress Anna Taylor-Joy and Ralph Fiennes, I believe, who plays the father. They're dynamic, but also just them on their own are really great standouts, but everyone's really good in this movie. They got really good child actors. The mom is great. And what I like is they take this great concept idea like the witch scare, and they kind of condense it down and place it in this small story. It's just we're following this family the whole time. There's very few other characters, and it really raises the stakes because of that. And I think that was a smart idea. But I bring up the acting because all of them have these strong New England accents. They speak without contractions, and it's a very specific way of specific type of dialogue that this movie has that is immediately had me sold. It just really pulls you right into this time period, and not for a second do the cracks ever become apparent. It always feels like you're in this time period. So kudos to the actors and the writing, because I was sold the whole time. I kind of like that this movie takes place in New England at this early 1600s phase, because it's interesting because time periods like this, or any a period piece in general, makes for great horror and great opportunity to tell these unique stories in the genre. Films like The Others and this one do that really well, and it's something that I've always been shocked by that not many other films take advantage of, because it's definitely something that gives your film a unique personality, and this is no exception. And really the kind of emotional crux of this movie is this family, while yes, they are being pushed away from their Puritan roots, they're also in a way being pushed away from their Puritan faith. Something interesting, I always find it unique when horror movies use the ideas of religion as a kind of a stepping stone for their stories, because it's something of almost an outdated trend. It used to be very prominent with films like The Exorcist or The Omen, because the idea of something like religion being placed in the threat of horror was very frightening to a lot of audiences. But it's kind of a thing that's become outdated purely because with the new modern age, everyone's kind of finding their own faiths or their own religions or non-religions. So it's not something that can really hone in on a lot of audiences anymore. But that being said, this movie takes that to its advantage and puts you in the shoes of this family. While you might not be of faith or religion, I think you can definitely relate to these characters. And I think what helps that is because it is such a small cast, you're stuck with these people for so long, you kind of come to find their mindset relatable. So yeah, something that I found interesting by this movie was that the suspense, a lot of it is built on irrational fears or kind of belief or disbeliefs in what's actually occurring around them. Is this witch curse real? Is it not? Who's to blame and who's innocent? It is a lot of irrational thinking, but it's framed in such a way that you can understand and even sympathize with these characters and what they're going through. I know a lot of people have compared this type of narrative to the Adam and Eve story from the early books of the Bible, which I found to be interesting because there are a lot of parallels there. Just the fact that it kind of uses those similar ideas of temptation and sin to kind of be placed as a threat or a stepping stone to greater suspense in this movie. So yeah, I mentioned earlier that this movie is a slow burn, but by the end, I think I would say probably within the last third of the movie, definitely towards the second act, and then definitely the third act, the suspense has built up so much to that point that it's nearly unbearable. This is a very intense movie. Like I said, the acting is a huge attribute to that, but the way it's shot, it's very visually mesmerizing. They use this time period, not only that, but also the environment around them, this giant field, this farm they live on, and also the woods that kind of shroud them. They use that to complete advantage. Some of the scenes that take place in the woods are just amazing. The way they're shot, it puts you on such edge. You always feel like these characters are being watched or something is lurking out in the open. I like that there's not an overuse of blood or gore in this movie. I think that has a place in horror movies. But the fact that this movie doesn't rely on that is great. It kind of aims more at the psychological side of things. But not only that, but when they do show something horrific, it really works because you're caught off guard because they don't shove it in your face. It's not obnoxious about it. There's no use of jump scares really. Any, sound that's used to scare you is intentional through the sound design. This movie has great sound. Um, but yeah, no, there's some really good visual imagery in here that really kind of sends shivers down your spine. Everything in this movie just oozes horror without being so upfront about it. Like I said, it's a subtle type of movie that is kind of rare, especially nowadays. Um, it kind of really harkens back to the early days of horror cinema in the sense that it relies more on atmosphere than anything. I think one of my least favorite trends that the horror genre has ever gone through is the torture porn genre. Something that really emphasizes or exclaims on like body horror, or not necessarily body horror, but like torture, like the misfortune of others being the main scare of the movie. It just always seemed cheap to me and just kind of not fun, just kind of miserable to watch, and also kind of lazy. If your main focus, like stuff like the Human Centipede movies, that the main focus of those movies is just to be as shocking as possible. And sure, yeah, maybe it's shocking when you're watching it, but it doesn't really stick with you. There's no substance to it because they rely so much on that visual shock. It kind of leaves your mind just as quickly as it enters it. So yeah, this movie definitely sticks with you. It's one of those, I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine about this, but it's one of those rare movies in which you feel like you're in a dreamlike state, almost having a nightmare while watching it, because there is a very surreal tone to it. I think the pacing is perfect. It's just an hour and a half. Every scene is just given just enough time. And I think to tell this type of story in the amount of time it does, the pacing was perfect. Like I said, acting was great. Visuals, really enthralling. The score and sound design were just wonderfully done. But yeah, it's just really nice to see a really almost classy, very well made horror movie, because that's kind of a rarity. But I am happy to see that movies like this, It Follows and hopefully Hereditary, are kind of making a revamp on the genre. And like, this is a genre to take seriously, which I really appreciate and admire. It's good to see films like this kind of returning to the more classic 70s-esque type of horror where it's more based on character, story, and visuals rather than just cheap scares and making a very quick cash grab horror movie that you'll forget about just like that, because this is definitely one that'll stick with you. But yeah, time will tell what people think of Hereditary. I, for one, am very excited. I've got my ticket ready already. Um, but yeah, I plan on doing a review of Hereditary as well. I hope you all enjoyed this. I will definitely try to get as many Nerd Theater episodes up in the near future as I can, but everyone's got their own schedule. Things have been busy, but the more time I can devote to this, the better, because I would like to be more consistent with my uploads. So thank you all for being patient with that, and I hope you all enjoyed this episode. But until next time, stay tuned, you guys.